Hi guys, it's ASBYT and I have two phones right here. One of them costs a minimum of £469 and this one cost around £60. And of course both devices were created by ONEPLUS. Let's take a closer look. Right, so on the table in front of me we have two different ONEPLUS phones. We have the ONEPLUS 6, which is the latest available flagship from ONEPLUS, and on my right hand side we are delving back in time. We are going old school. We are going to take a closer look at the ONEPLUS One, the first ever phone from the company ONEPLUS, the device that started everything for them, just to see where and how it all began. And I picked this up for around £60, and I want to do a kind of mini hands-on first review to show you whether I still think it might be a device that you could use in 2018 if you can get your hands on it. So first of all, I'm going to put my details in, and then I'm going to hopefully turn the brightness up because it's a little bit dark when you compare it to the ONEPLUS 6. I'm sure we can, and then I'll talk you through some of the actual specs, etc. Right, so before we jump onto that straight away, I will mention the fact that, as you can see, one of the screens when you load it up says mod ready, and it's a bit of information about the fact that this phone is modified, and it's a version of Android that has been modified using CyanogenOS, which, like today, you've got companies like Samsung, Huawei, Xiaomi that all sort of put their own skin over the top of Android. This is not really any different. It was just back in 2014 when this phone was actually released. It was a fairly popular modification of the Android OS. There were a few issues with CyanogenOS. It was a little bit glitchy with certain actions when it was first released on the ONEPLUS One, but they did actually keep updating it in the months after the release, and many people found that a lot of the problems they had originally were actually sorted out. Now, like with OxygenOS, which the latest ONEPLUS device uses, it's fairly close to stock Android. It just has a few little tweaks here and there to hopefully, back in them days, make it a better user experience for certain customers. Now, the main thing about CyanogenOS was themes. You could actually change different system colors and fonts, etc., right the way through pretty much the OS. So boot animation, fonts, quick setting tiles, and lots more. Now, one thing about the ONEPLUS One, it kind of wasn't available to buy. It was on an invitation basis, which was a little bit odd, but what it did do is it created a lot of buzz about the product, so there was a higher demand than actually handsets available. And of course, going forwards, that was quite a promising start to a new business. I was, of course, lucky enough to be able to be given one of those invitations a few years later in the form of an eBay purchase. Secondhand for around £60, and to be honest, it's in pretty good nick. There are, of course, the token dings across the metal frame, etc., that you would expect from a device this old, but the back looks in pretty good condition, and of course the screen also looks in pretty good condition. There's not really any scratches that I can see on there. I think that's a pretty good phone for around £60. First of all, I'm going to show you the specs, and then I'm going to talk to you about the actual design of the product. So the actual specs we are rocking on here, Android 6.0.1. Now, I've only just turned it on, so I'm not sure how many updates will actually happen now from this. One of the biggest specs on this phone is, of course, it had the Qualcomm Snapdragon 801 chipset, which at the time was pretty much the best on the market. It was the same chipset used in the Samsung S5, for example. It had 3GB of RAM, which was 1GB more than the 2GB of RAM in the Samsung S5. Adreno 330 GPU, same as the S5, with internal storage of either 16GB or 64GB. Now, in terms of the screen, we have a 5.5-inch IPS panel, and I'm just going to turn the brightness up so we can go up a little bit. As you can see, it's still not quite as bright as the AMOLED display we've got on the ONEPLUS 6, and this was a 16:9 ratio, 1920 by 1080, with a PPI density of 401, which is only 1 pixel less than the 402 we see on the ONEPLUS 6 today. So not the AMOLED, but again, this was a lot earlier, this phone. One more spec is the battery in this is 3100 mAh. Not groundbreaking, but at the same time, it's pretty decent. Remember, you have a smaller display, so it is going to drain less battery. All in all, everything you pretty much expect from a top flagship device in the year that it was released. And just to break it down, if you think about some of those hardware specs, comparing that to the Samsung S5, and then we look at price, the Samsung S5 cost around $600 US. This one came on the market for $299 US, and that is why the fact that it was quite close to stock Android and had very similar specs to the Samsung S5, that's why there was so much buzz around this phone in the tech community, and it gave OnePlus a platform to move forwards and actually try and deliver every year in this motto, top flagship specs at a cheaper price. It had a 71.9% screen to body ratio, again comparing to the 83% that we have on the OnePlus 6. We do have larger bezels, but again, this was pretty much a standard phone design back then, and it was still a fairly big phone back then to a lot of its competitors, and it's pretty much the same form factor as the OnePlus 6. This is something that OnePlus tend to do pretty well year on year, and that's maintain a design language. So the actual footprint remains very similar year on year. Obviously materials change, screens change, specs change, but that sort of rounded back and that flat front tend to be pretty much the norm. Now, one thing we don't have on here is the alert slider. That came later, but we do have the power button there, and we also have our volume rocker up and down there as well. Headphone jack, which is a firm favourite for the OnePlus community, was on the top. I obviously prefer the bottom like I mentioned in previous videos, but we still had a headphone jack. And again, on the bottom we had a charging port and the speakers. The charging port was of course micro USB, that was the technology then. Now, one of the main differences is, and this is another thing that has been a kind of underlying theme across a lot of OnePlus devices, and that's of course this sandstone design. You either love it or hate it. They have brought it back in devices since, but I actually surprisingly quite like it. I didn't think I would, but it's, I mean, in terms of grip, if you are a clumsy person, you want to get a sandstone phone or a sandstone case or whatever, because it does give you that added texture to hold. It's certainly not slippy, it won't fall off anything, and it's certainly a phone that will probably stand out amongst others. And the actual performance is nothing short of brilliant when you think about, again, the price. We're talking under $300 US, and this phone was crazy fast for its time. Now we're going to jump on to the rear camera. Now this was a 30 megapixel sensor with f2.0 aperture, and believe it or not, it can shoot 4K at 30 frames a second. Again, if you think back to the year we're talking about, that was pretty impressive. Some phones now still don't do 4K footage. Front-facing camera is a 5 megapixel with f2.0 aperture, and you can record footage up to 1080p at 30 frames a second, so full HD on that front-facing camera. One thing I am impressed with this camera is of how flat it is to the back. As you well know, I'm not a massive fan of camera bumps, which you do see on the OnePlus 6 there. So going forwards, I would prefer a thicker phone if we could get rid of that camera bump personally, but we don't have a camera bump on the OnePlus One. I'm just going to do a couple of quick snaps on the camera and a couple of little video clips as well, so that you can get an idea for how it actually performs, if you are indeed looking to try and pick one of these up for £60. So it's time to run the slideshow. Bam! Now, camera performance is usually where a lot of smartphones, a lot of cheaper budget smartphones let themselves down. And while this certainly wasn't the best camera on the market in 2014, it's really not that bad. And it is certainly better than other phones that were more expensive. This phone was available in the sandstone black and the silk white, which we do see currently with the OnePlus 6 range again. The silk white is another recurring theme. They do tend to have similar things that run all the way through the years. And one thing I have noticed is there seems to be a slight issue with the screen. If you take a closer look at the clock on here, if I scroll to the left, there is a very, very faint number still there. I mean, this phone is years old, but something that I point out. All in all, I must admit, I'm mightily impressed at this phone for £60. When it was released, critics were very, very impressed with it, and you would expect that based on the specs and the price, but 4 years on, and I still don't feel I would have a problem using this. Obviously, the camera isn't as good. It isn't as quick as today's flagships. It doesn't necessarily look design-wise in terms of the display, etc., as nice as the latest models on the market, but I'd certainly prefer to spend £60 on this than £100 or £150 on some of the real budget smartphones that are available today. Obviously, you would have to buy one second-hand from eBay, for example, and you'd have to make sure that it's in reasonable nick. But if you can find one, I'd recommend for the money, I'd recommend buying one. Here's where you guys come in. Let me know in the comment section below what you think about the OnePlus One. What did you think of it when you bought it? Have it now? Didn't buy it and don't have it now? What do you think of it? Is it something that you would potentially consider for if you can get it on eBay for £60 to £100? Would you do it? Or are there other phones that are new that are better on the market? Like and share if you did enjoy this video and found it helpful. Dislike this video if you didn't like it and you didn't find it helpful. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel and you've turned on the notification bell if you do enjoy everything OnePlus or smartphones in general or tech in general. I pretty much do daily content on this channel. I'll love you and leave you. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.